He fed Bigfoot for years. Then the government showed up and took everything. I'm telling you this because someone needs to know what really happens when you make contact. I'm a retired game warden, 30 years tracking wildlife in the Cascades, and I know the difference between a bear print and something that shouldn't exist. Summer of 2019, I bought 40 acres in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Within weeks, I was finding 18-inch tracks with 5 toes, stone cairns appearing overnight. My compost sorted like someone had used hands. So I started leaving food, and for over a year, something left gifts back, cleaned my tools, built structures facing my cabin window, answered my axe strikes with wood knocks from the ridgeline. Then in August 2020, black SUVs rolled up my drive, Homeland Security badges, confiscated cameras, journals, everything. Forced me to sign federal papers threatening prison if I ever spoke about it. But what they couldn't take was the truth. They've known for decades, and they'll destroy anyone who gets too close. What else are they hiding in those mountains? I bought the cabin sight unseen off a distressed property listing in March of 2019. 40 acres in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, about 12 miles southeast of Randall, Washington. The realtor emailed me 6 photos peeling paint, sagging porch, moss on the roof, and a price so low I figured there had to be a catch. Turned out, the catch was just isolation. No neighbors within 3 miles, power lines ended at the main forest road, and cell service was a joke. Perfect. I arrived on the 23rd of June with everything I owned in the bed of my F-250, clothes, camping gear, my grandfather's Remington 870, and 3 banker's boxes of paperwork from 30 years with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. 30 years tracking poachers through the Cascades, reading sign, knowing when something didn't belong in the woods. 30 years that ended with a pension appeal, denial, and divorce papers served the same week. The state claimed I'd violated protocol during an investigation. I claimed they were covering for a timber company exec's son who'd been running an illegal bear part operation. We both claimed things. They had better lawyers. The cabin looked worse in person. Single story, maybe 900 square feet, built sometime in the 70s from cedar that hadn't seen treatment in decades. The porch steps were soft with rot. Inside smelled like mouse droppings and mildew, but the roof was intact and the wood stove still had its grate. The previous owner, a guy named Carlson, according to the deed, had left in a hurry. Half his tools were still in the shed, a fence repair, abandoned mid-post, canned goods in the cupboard with 2 years left before expiration. I remember standing in that dim kitchen, looking at his dusty coffee mug in the dish rack, wondering what made someone walk away from their own property without even packing. I didn't wonder long. I was too tired. That first week, I fell into the rhythm of survival. Patching the roof, clearing brush from around the cabin for fire safety, fishing the creek that ran through the northeast corner of the property, cutthroat trout, decent size, almost made the isolation feel like retirement instead of exile. I'd wake before dawn out of habit, brew coffee on the propane camp stove until I got the wood stove sorted, then spend my days doing the kind of maintenance work that keeps a place from swallowing itself back into the forest. But something was off from the beginning. The woods were too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. I'd spent 3 decades in the backcountry, and you develop an ear for the baseline. Stellar's jays arguing, squirrels thrashing through undergrowth, woodpeckers working snags, ravens calling to each other in the distance. Here, nothing, just wind, in the Douglas firs and the creek running over stones. Even the insects seemed muted, like someone had turned down the volume on the whole forest. I told myself it was the season, or maybe fire suppression had changed the habitat. Told myself a lot of things. The first real sign came on my 10th day there. I'd been tossing kitchen scraps into a compost pile about 30 yards from the cabin, coffee grounds, apple cores, fish guts, standard practice for someone living off-grid. Bears would get into it eventually, I figured, but that was fine. I knew how to secure food properly, and a little bear activity would feel normal. Except when I went out on the morning of July 3rd, the pile had been ransacked in a way that made no sense. Not scattered, sorted. Vegetable matter in one area, protein in another. Eggshells placed almost deliberately on a flat rock like someone examining them. No claw marks on the ground, no scat. The surrounding dirt showed disturbance, but nothing I could identify clearly. Just vague depressions, like something had knelt there, working methodically. I crouched next to it for 20 minutes, trying to make my brain accept a bear explanation. But I'd seen thousands of bear-disturbed sites in my career. They rip and scatter. They dig and maul. They don't organize. I photographed it on my Android no service out here, but the camera still worked and told myself it was a fluke. Then I walked back to the cabin, checking over my shoulder more times than I wanted to admit. That night, I loaded the Remington and leaned it next to the door, just in case. I'm methodical by training. You don't last 3 decades as a game warden by jumping to conclusions or trusting your gut over evidence. So I established a routine, the kind that lets you notice when something breaks the pattern. Mornings I'd chop wood until my bad knee started talking to me. Old injury from a pursuit up near Glacier Peak back in 2011 then. Spend midday repairing the cabin. The roof leaked in 3 places. The porch needed 8 new boards. The window frames were so warped I had to plane them down to get proper seals. Afternoons I'd fish the creek, smoke what I caught in a little rig I built from sheet metal and alder, and before dark I'd do a property walk. 40 acres isn't much, but on foot with uneven terrain it's enough to notice things. And I noticed things. The stone cairn appeared on my 3rd week there, right near the woodshed. 5 river rocks stacked in a deliberate pyramid, about 18 inches tall, balanced too carefully to be accidental. I'd walked past that exact spot the evening before, I was certain. The rocks were creek smooth, which meant someone or something had carried them uphill about 40 yards. I photographed it from 3 angles, measured it with my tape measure. The base stone was roughly 8 inches across, top stone maybe 3. The gaps between them were finger width, like they'd been placed with precision. I left it standing and made a note in the field journal I'd started keeping. July 19th. Cairn appeared overnight near shed. No tracks visible, ground too hard. Then came the print. Morning of July 22nd. I'd walked down to the creek to check the crawfish trap I'd set coffee can with holes punched in it, baited with salmon skin, and there in the mud of the bank was a track that stopped me cold. 5 toes. Roughly 18 inches long, maybe 7 wide at the ball. Toes splayed outward in a pattern that suggested bipedal weight distribution. The heel impression deep enough that whatever made it was heavy. Very heavy. The edge definition was clean despite the mud being slightly damp, which told me it was recent. The stride, I found 2 more prints heading upstream, was over 6 feet between steps. I've cast thousands of tracks in my career. Black bear, grizzly, cougar, wolf, elk, moose, every ungulate in the Cascades. I've seen hoax, prints, 2 wooden feet, rubber stamps, even one guy using prosthetics for a viral video. This didn't match any of them. The depth was wrong for a person, even a large person. The toe spread suggested barefoot locomotion, but the size made that impossible, unless I was dealing with someone over 8 feet tall with bone structure that didn't match human proportions. And the gait length, 6-foot strides, meant either running, which would show different pressure patterns, or something with legs significantly longer than human standard. I spent 2 hours there, photographing from every angle, measuring, checking for other signs. Found nothing else. No scat, no hair, no disturbed vegetation beyond the immediate track line. Whatever made it had walked through without breaking a single twig or displacing any streamside stones except where its feet landed. My training said hoax or misidentification. My 30 years in the woods said something else. I hiked back to the cabin, pulled out my Nikon DSLR, the good camera I'd kept from my warden days, and spent the afternoon setting up a basic trail camera aimed at the compost pile and the stone cairn. Bushnell Trophy Cam, 12 megapixel, motion activated with infrared for night shots. I'd used dozens of them for documenting poaching activity and wildlife surveys. Simple, reliable, impossible to miss anything within 30 feet. Or so I thought. I checked it obsessively for 5 days, reviewing the SD card every morning, hoping for something conclusive. Deer, mostly. A raccoon once. Then, on the morning of July 27th, I pulled the card and found something that made my hands shake while I scrolled through the images. Frames 1 through 43. Normal nocturnal activity. A doe browsing at 11:38 p.m. Raccoon at 12:06 a.m. Nothing at 1:15, 1:45, 2:03. Frame 44, 2:18 a.m. Completely black. Frames 45 through 62. Black, static, or smeared as if something had rubbed mud directly across the lens. Frame 63, 4:31 a.m. Normal view resumed. Compost pile, undisturbed. Cairn still standing. But when I walked out to check the camera itself, I found a smear of what looked like deliberate mud handprints across the lens housing. And hanging from the nail I'd pounded into the shed's corner post, the one that held my spare hatchet, was a tuft of coarse black hair, thick as baling wire, unlike anything I'd ever seen on a bear or elk. I stood there in the morning sun, holding that hair between my fingers, understanding with absolute certainty that something in these woods knew about the camera, knew about me, and had made sure I understood it was aware of being watched. That's when I stopped pretending this was normal wildlife behavior. That's when I started the feeding. I need to be clear about something. I'm not a cryptozoologist. I don't believe in monsters or forest spirits or any of that nonsense. 30 years tracking actual animals through actual wilderness teaches you to trust evidence over stories. But evidence was telling me something my training couldn't explain. The hair sample sat in a Ziploc bag on my kitchen table for 3 days while I tried to rationalize it. Too coarse for bear, I'd handled thousands of bear hair samples, black and grizzly both. Too thick for elk or moose. The individual strands were almost wire-like, dark black with a slightly reddish tint at the roots under my headlamp's beam. I photographed it next to a ruler. Individual hairs roughly 4 to 5 inches long, diameter close to twice that of human hair. On July 30th, I made a decision that probably crossed about a dozen ethical lines. I started the feeding deliberately. There was a flat-topped stump about 50 yards from the cabin, just inside the tree line where the Douglas firs got dense. Good sight lines from my kitchen window. I'd been using it as a splitting base. But that morning, I cleared it off and left my first intentional offering. Venison trimmings from a road-killed deer I'd found on Forest Road 23, 3 overripe apples from the bag I'd bought in Randall, and half a loaf of stale bread. Then I repositioned the trail camera, angling it from a new tree about 20 feet away, higher up this time, lens partially concealed behind a branch. If something was smart enough to find and obscure the first camera, maybe a less obvious position would work. I checked it every morning. August 1st, 2nd, 3rd, nothing touched. The venison started to turn gray, flies clustering. August 5th, I replaced it with fresh trout. 8th, nothing. 10th, nothing. The bread went moldy. I felt ridiculous, like I was leaving offerings to something that didn't exist, my isolation finally catching up with me. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe I'd manufactured a mystery because the silence of my own failure was too loud. But on the morning of August 17th, everything changed. The stump was empty, completely clean, not scattered, not partially eaten. Gone. The fish, the apples I'd left 2 days prior, even the moldy bread I'd forgotten to remove. And beside the stump, pressed into a small patch of exposed soil, was something that made my throat tighten. A knuckle walk impression. I've seen gorilla locomotion in documentaries, the way they rest their weight on the curled fingers of one hand while moving. This was similar but larger, much larger. The knuckle depressions were deep, maybe 1.5 inches into the soft earth, suggesting something with serious mass briefly supporting itself there before standing upright. The spacing suggested a hand easily twice the width of mine. But it was what I found nearby that stopped me cold. Scattered in a small clearing about 10 feet from the stump were the entrails of a rabbit, not torn apart the way a coyote or bobcat would do it, separated. Stomach in, one spot, intestines carefully laid out almost in a coil, the pelt cleanly removed and folded. The precision suggested hands, or something very much like hands, with enough dexterity to perform what looked almost surgical. I spent an hour documenting everything with my Nikon, measuring, making notes in the field journal I'd started keeping. The journal was just a waterproof notebook I'd used for patrol logs, but now it was becoming something else, a record of something I couldn't explain and wasn't sure I should be recording. That night, I wrote, August 17th. First confirmed taking of offerings. Knuckle walk impression suggests quadrupedal movement capability, but primary locomotion likely bipedal based on previous tracks. Rabbit processing indicates tool use or advanced manual dexterity. Whatever this is, it's not operating on instinct alone. I sat on my porch until well after dark, Remington across my lap, listening to the forest. The silence had weight now, presence. I remembered stories from my warden days, loggers who'd quit jobs rather than work certain valleys, hunters who'd sworn they'd heard voices in the timber that weren't human but weren't animal either. I'd always dismissed them as too much whiskey and too little sleep. Now I wasn't sure what I'd dismissed. September and early October passed in a strange routine. I'd leave offerings every 3 days, fish mostly, sometimes foraged berries, once a haunch from a deer I'd legally harvested during bow season. The pattern was consistent. Food would disappear within 48 hours, usually overnight, and I'd find evidence of visitation. More knuckle walk impressions. Once, an arrangement of small stones that spelled nothing but suggested intention. Broken branches stacked in what looked almost like a marker. The trail camera remained useless. I'd repositioned it 4 times, tried different angles, even set up a second unit I'd ordered online and had delivered to the Randall Post office. Same result every time: corrupted files, smeared lenses, or footage that showed nothing but static during the hours something was clearly visiting. It knew about the cameras. That was the part that kept me up at night. But I was learning things too. Whatever this was operated on a schedule tied to the moon phase. Activity increased dramatically during new moons when the forest was darkest. It avoided windy nights when sound carried unpredictably, suggesting it relied heavily on stealth. And it was teaching me, deliberately leaving evidence in places I'd find it, almost like breadcrumbs, leading me toward acceptance of its existence. By mid-October, the weather had turned. First, snow came on the 16th, just a dusting that melted by noon, but the temperature was dropping fast. I split and stacked 4 cords of wood, winterized the cabin's gaps with expanding foam, laid in supplies from Randall, canned goods, propane, ammunition I hoped I wouldn't need. The morning of October 23rd, I woke to find the offerings gone again. But this time there was something new. The food had been taken 3 days prior. I'd left a whole salmon I'd caught in the creek, plus a bag of apples and some jerky I'd made. All gone. But what replaced it made my hands shake when I picked it up. A single black hair, coarse as wire, caught deliberately on the nail where I'd hung my spare hatchet on the shed's exterior wall. It was placed there, not snagged, I was certain. And beneath it, pressed into the earth that was now going hard with cold, was the clearest print I'd seen yet. 5 toes, 18 inches long, 7 wide at the ball. The heel impression was so deep I could see the dermal ridge patterns, not quite like human fingerprints but similar, suggesting skin texture rather than fur covering the foot. The toes showed clear articulation, each one having pressed down independently, suggesting conscious foot placement rather than a simple step. I measured it 3 times, photographed it from 6 angles, made a field sketch in my journal with measurements annotated. This wasn't misidentification or hoax. This was real. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and admitted something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I was no longer documenting wildlife behavior. I was in contact with something unknown. Something that demonstrated intelligence, tool use, and what looked increasingly like intentional communication. The question wasn't whether to continue. I was already in too deep, too committed to the mystery. The question was what came next. That night, I did something I hadn't done since arriving. I spoke out loud to the empty forest. "I know you're out there," I said, standing on my porch in the October cold, my breath visible in the air. "I don't know what you are, but I see you, and I'm not leaving." The forest gave me nothing but silence in return. But 2 days later, when the first real snow came and I was splitting wood, near dusk, I heard it. Deep, resonant knocks from the ridgeline. 3 strikes, spaced exactly 3 seconds apart, matching the rhythm of my axe perfectly. I froze, mid-swing. The knocking stopped, and I understood with absolute certainty that something was answering me. Winter hit hard that year. First real storm came November 8th, dropping 14 inches overnight and closing Forest Road 23 for 3 days. I didn't mind. I had 4 cords of wood stacked, propane for cooking, a freezer full of venison, and smoked fish. The isolation felt different now, not loneliness, but anticipation. Something was out there, and I was learning its patterns. The wood knocks had continued sporadically through late October and November, always at dusk, always from different locations on the ridgeline. Never close, never threatening, just present. Like someone announcing themselves from a distance. I'd stopped trying to record them after my phone's audio files came back as static. Whatever this was, it didn't want documentation. On January 9th, 2020, we got hit with a blizzard that buried the property under 2 feet of powder. Temperature dropped to maybe 15 degrees during the day, 0 at night, the kind of cold that makes the trees crack and pop like gunfire. I spent most of the day inside, feeding the wood stove, rationing my movements because my bad knee was already complaining. Around 4 in the afternoon, light fading fast, I realized I was down to maybe 6 logs inside. The rest of my split wood was stacked against the shed, 30 yards away through knee-deep snow. Should have brought more in earlier. Stupid mistake. I bundled up Carhartt jacket, insulated gloves, wool cap, and grabbed my axe out of habit. The snow had that squeaky texture that means it's too cold to pack. My breath came out in clouds that hung in the still air. The forest was completely silent, not even wind. Just that dead, muffled quiet you get when snow dampens every sound. I made it to the woodpile and started splitting a frozen round, working up some body heat. The axe rang against the wood, sharp cracks echoing across the property. 3 strikes, 4, 5, getting a rhythm going. Then I heard it answer. 3 knocks from the ridgeline, maybe 200 yards out. Deep, resonant, like someone striking a hollow log with a club. The spacing was exact 3 seconds between each knock, matching the rhythm of my axe perfectly. I froze mid-swing. The knocking stopped. I stood there in the failing light, axe held above my shoulder, listening so hard my ears hurt. My heart was hammering, but I kept still, some instinct telling me movement was a bad idea. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The only sound was my own breathing. Slowly, I lowered the axe and resumed splitting. 3 careful strikes, 3 answering knocks from the ridgeline. Same spacing. Same deliberate rhythm. Something was mimicking me, not just making noise, responding. I set the axe down carefully, loaded my arms with split wood, and walked back to the cabin without looking toward the tree line. My hands shook so badly I dropped a log on the porch steps. I left it there, got inside, locked the door, something I hadn't done since arriving, and stood by the window, watching the forest darken. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside made me reach for the Remington I'd moved beside my bed. But nothing approached the cabin. The forest stayed quiet, snow continuing to fall in that eerie silence. 2 days later, January 11th, the storm broke. I woke to brilliant sunshine on fresh snow, temperature risen to maybe 25 degrees. I needed to check my propane levels and clear the access road enough to reach my truck if an emergency came up. I stepped out onto the porch and stopped cold. Just beyond my fence line, maybe 40 yards out, was a structure that hadn't been there before. A lean-to. Crude, but deliberate, built from fresh-cut Douglas fir branches, still weeping frozen sap. The construction was almost architectural branches, woven together and supported by 3 main posts driven into the frozen ground. It was positioned to face directly toward my kitchen window, angled so that anyone inside would have a clear view of the cabin. The snow around it was trampled by tracks I recognized immediately. Massive 5-toed impressions, some showing individual toe articulation, others showing the full foot pattern. The stride length suggested something moving on 2 legs, deliberately, methodically, while building. I approached slowly, photographing everything with shaking hands. The branches had been cut cleanly, not torn or broken, but severed with force. Some showed what looked like twist marks, as if they'd been wrung from living trees. The structure was maybe 6 feet tall, 4 feet deep, open on one side facing my cabin. Inside the lean-to, pressed into the snow, was a single, clear handprint. Not a paw, not a hoof, a hand. 5 digits, opposable thumb, palm print showing dermal ridges. But the scale was wrong. The palm alone was nearly 8 inches wide, fingers extending another 6 inches beyond that. Something with hands this size would stand at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. I spent an hour documenting everything. When I finally went back inside, I sat at my kitchen table and forced myself to write in my journal with as much clinical detachment as I could manage. January 11th. Structure erected overnight during blizzard. Fresh cut materials, deliberate construction, position for observation. Whatever built this wanted to watch me, and it wanted me to know. The isolation I'd been seeking suddenly felt very different. I wasn't alone on this property. I never had been. And something was studying me with the same methodical patience I'd used tracking poachers for 30 years. Spring came late in 2020. Snow lingered into April, then melted fast when it finally broke, turning the access road into a mud slough and swelling the creek until it ran brown and violent through the property. By early May, the forest had transformed Douglas firs, showing new growth, birds returning with their territorial calls, the oppressive winter silence replaced by something closer to normal, but not quite normal. Never quite. I'd maintained the feeding through winter, leaving offerings even when the snow was waist deep and my knee screamed with every step to the stump. The food always disappeared. And the exchanges had evolved into something I couldn't dismiss as simple wildlife behavior anymore. On May 3rd, I left a whole steelhead trout I'd caught in the swollen creek, plus some foraged mushrooms and wild onions. The next morning, the food was gone. In its place, draped carefully over my ATV seat like someone had folded it there, was a deer hide, fresh deer hide. Still warm when I touched it, blood not yet dried on the flesh side. The hide had been removed expertly, not torn or chewed, but separated from the carcass with precision that suggested knives or tool use. It was folded once, placed deliberately, the fur side up and clean of debris. This wasn't a predator caching food or marking territory. This was a gift. I stood there in the morning sun, holding that hide in my hands, and understood I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. Whatever was out there wasn't just tolerating my presence or taking advantage of free food. It was reciprocating, communicating. Over the next weeks, the pattern intensified. I'd leave fish, berries, sometimes just fresh water in a clean bowl. In return, I'd find things that made my training and 30 years of wildlife experience completely inadequate. Fallen limbs cleared from my access road, stacked in neat piles at the forest edge like someone had done trail maintenance. An arrangement of bleached elk antlers positioned in a geometric pattern near the creek, definitely not natural, definitely intentional. Once, after a windstorm knocked a branch onto my cabin roof, I woke to find it removed and placed on the ground 10 feet away, positioned parallel to the cabin wall. And the shadows. I'd catch glimpses now at dusk movement through the undergrowth too fast and fluid to be bear or elk, too large to be human. Sometimes I'd detect the stench Ruth had mentioned in one of our old conversations about supposed Bigfoot encounters, back when I'd laughed them off. Ammonia mixed with wet fur and something older, muskier, like nothing I'd smelled in decades of backcountry work. On May 27th, I had my first almost sighting. I was on the porch at sunset, drinking coffee and watching the tree line like I did most evenings now. Movement caught my eye, something large shifting through the undergrowth about 50 yards out. Not trying to hide, just moving parallel to the cabin, deliberate and unhurried. I stayed still, barely breathing. The shape was massive. Easily 7 feet tall, even moving in a crouch, shoulders wider than any human. Moving on 2 legs with a gait that seemed wrong, too fluid, too powerful, like watching someone who'd never learned human biomechanics. It paused once, turned toward the cabin, and I swear I saw a silhouette of a head tilting, as if studying me. Then it melted into the darkening forest without a sound. I didn't move for 10 minutes after it vanished. When I finally went inside, my coffee cup was shaking so badly, I had to set it down. That night I started talking out loud more deliberately. I'd been speaking to myself out of habit for months-old patrol routine, something to fill the silence. But now, I directed it outward. "I see you," I said to the empty kitchen. "I know you're out there. I'm not afraid." That last part was a lie. I was terrified, but also fascinated. Also grateful for the proof that my instincts hadn't failed me, that the anomalous tracks I'd reported for years weren't misidentifications or hoaxes. Something intelligent was living in these mountains. Something that had avoided detection by staying just beyond confirmation, just past belief. And for reasons I couldn't understand, it had chosen to reveal itself to me. I need to tell you about the night of May 19th, 2020, because it changed everything. Not just what I believed about the forest, what I believed about intelligence itself. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. The exchanges with whatever was out there had become routine enough that I'd stopped jumping at every sound, but my body stayed alert in a way I couldn't control. Old patrol instincts, maybe. Or something deeper, some ancient part of my brain recognizing I was sharing territory with an apex predator. That night was humid, unseasonably warm for mid-May in the mountains. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and pulled on jeans and boots, figuring I'd sit on the porch with coffee and watch the stars. The moon was just past new, dark enough that the Milky Way stretched overhead like spilled milk. I stepped outside, mug in hand, and froze. 30 yards away, beside my propane tank, something was crouched in the darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly. The shape was massive, easily 8 feet tall, even in a crouch. Shoulders so broad they looked wrong, like someone had stretched human proportions beyond any natural scale. It wasn't moving, just breathing. Slow, measured breaths that I could hear from the porch, each exhale visible as vapor in the cool air despite the relative warmth. My training kicked in before panic could. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements. Predators, and this was absolutely a predator, regardless of what it ate, respond to flight behavior with pursuit. I stayed perfectly still, coffee mug halfway to my lips, barely breathing. The figure didn't react to my presence. It just continued that slow, rhythmic breathing, crouched beside the tank like it was examining it, or resting, or waiting. Minutes passed. 5, maybe 10. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might hear it. My hands stayed steady only through decades of practice staying calm in dangerous situations. But this wasn't a cornered poacher or an aggressive bear. This was something else entirely. Then, it moved. Not quickly, that's what I remember most clearly. It rose to its full height with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something that large. 9 feet tall, maybe more. The shoulders were massive, the head proportionally small but still larger than human, sitting forward on the body in a way that suggested enormous neck musculature, arms that hung past where human knees would be. For a moment, just a heartbeat, it stood there in profile, and I saw the silhouette clearly against the slightly lighter sky. Not quite human, not quite ape. Something in between, or something entirely different that my brain couldn't properly categorize. Then it melted backward into the tree line. Not running, not crashing through undergrowth, just disappearing. Silent and complete, as if the forest had simply absorbed it. I didn't move for another 10 minutes. When I finally lowered my coffee mug, my hands were shaking so badly I spilled half of it. I set it down on the porch rail and walked slowly to where the figure had been crouched. The stench hit me first. Ammonia and wet fur, yes, but also something organic and ancient, like the smell of a cave that's been sealed for centuries. And there, in the dirt beside the propane tank, pressed deep into the soil, was a handprint. Each finger was clearly defined, the thumb offset in an opposable position. The palm was massive, easily 9 inches across, with visible dermal ridges suggesting skin texture rather than fur or scales. Each digit was thick as a broom handle, the fingertips showing what looked like nails or claws, though I couldn't tell which in the dark. I photographed it with my phone's flashlight, measured it twice with my tape measure, sketched it in my field journal with dimensions annotated. The whole time my hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my kitchen with the Remington across my lap and every light in the cabin on, watching the windows, listening to the forest. But nothing approached again. The woods stayed quiet except for normal night sounds, owls, distant coyotes, the creek running over stones. 2 days later, I was still processing what I'd seen, trying to reconcile it with any known wildlife, when I found my tools. After the sighting by the propane tank, I became obsessed. Not in a healthy way, in the way someone gets fixated on a problem their training says can't exist, but their eyes know is real. I spent my days researching everything I could find online. Cryptozoology forums, where people shared grainy photos and dubious stories. The BFRO database with thousands of reported sightings going back decades. Academic papers on Gigantopithecus, the extinct giant ape some researchers thought might have survived in isolated pockets. Theories about relict hominids, evolutionary dead ends, species that had learned to avoid human contact so completely they'd become essentially invisible. Most of it was nonsense. Amateur speculation, hoaxes, misidentifications. But buried in the noise were patterns that made me uneasy. Multiple reports from the Cascades describing the same behaviors I'd observed: wood knocks, gifting, structure building, deliberate camera avoidance. Witnesses who sounded credible, people with outdoor experience who'd struggled to explain what they'd seen, and the consistency in the physical descriptions: 8 to 9 feet tall, broad shoulders, proportionally small head, arms longer than human, bipedal locomotion but capable of quadrupedal movement. The details matched across decades and geographic regions, in ways that suggested either coordinated hoaxing on a massive scale or something real. I maintained the feeding routine with near-religious discipline. Every 3 days I'd leave fresh fish, foraged berries, sometimes cooked venison. I documented everything in my journal: dates, times, weather conditions, what I'd left, what evidence I'd found. The journal had become less a scientific log and more an obsession manifest in ink and paper. The patterns became clearer. The creature I'd stopped pretending it was anything else visited primarily during new moons when the darkness was deepest. It avoided nights with strong winds when sound carried unpredictably, suggesting it relied on stealth and acoustic awareness. and it deliberately left evidence in places I'd find it, almost as if teaching me to recognize its presence. I tried new cameras, ordered a motion-activated unit with backup batteries and infrared capability, positioned it in different locations, tried different heights and angles. Same result every time. Either the footage was corrupted files showing nothing but static or digital artifacts, or the camera was gently relocated overnight, lens aimed at the ground like a deliberate rebuke. Once I found a camera moved 10 feet from where I'd mounted it, now sitting upright on a flat rock, lens aimed directly at the cabin. The message seemed clear. I see you watching. I know what you're doing. The intelligence behind this terrified me. This wasn't animal behavior. Animals don't understand camera technology. They don't relocate recording devices as a form of communication. Whatever was out there had observed humans long enough to understand our tools, our surveillance methods, our patterns. By early June, I'd accepted something that would have gotten me laughed out of any scientific conference. I was in contact with an unknown species of great ape, possibly a relict hominid, that demonstrated tool use, problem solving, and what appeared to be intentional communication. My field journal entry from June 7th, 2020. Subject demonstrates clear awareness of surveillance technology. Camera avoidance is not instinctive, it's learned or taught behavior. This suggests either individual experience with human observation attempts or cultural knowledge passed between individuals. If the latter, implies social structure and information sharing across generations. I sat back and read what I'd written, understanding how insane it would sound to anyone else. But I had the evidence. The tracks, the structures, the behaviors. The hair sample I'd kept in a Ziploc bag, locked in my file box. Hundreds of photographs that captured everything except the subject itself. And I had something else, something I barely admitted to myself. I wanted this to continue. The isolation I'd sought after my divorce and career collapse had been filled by something I'd never expected. Not just scientific curiosity, but connection, companionship, even, with something that chose to remain unseen but present. I wasn't alone anymore. And despite the fear that came with each encounter, that meant everything. By late June 2020, something had shifted. The relationship, and I can't think of another word for it, had evolved beyond simple feeding and observation into something closer to mutual recognition. Maybe even trust, though that word feels too human for what was happening. I'd started talking out loud more deliberately during my daily routines. Not just to myself anymore, but outward, as if narrating my actions to an audience I couldn't see. Going to check the fish trap now, I'd say, walking toward the creek. Left you some fresh berries by the stump. Salmon berries, the kind that grow near the old logging road. Sometimes not always, but often enough to be intentional, I'd hear responses. Not words. Guttural vocalizations from the forest, tonal patterns that seemed to acknowledge what I'd said. Low rumbles, sometimes. Other times, a series of clicks that reminded me of dolphins or whales, though much deeper in pitch. The exchanges had become routine enough that I'd stopped being constantly afraid. Still cautious, still aware I was sharing space with something powerful and unpredictable, but no longer terrified. The creature had demonstrated restraint for almost a year now. If it wanted to harm me, it had passed countless opportunities. On the evening of June 24th, I found something that made me understand how far this had gone. I'd been out clearing brush from around the cabin, fire season was coming, and the undergrowth was dry enough to worry about. I'd left my tools on the porch when I went inside for water. Hammer, handsaw, hatchet, basic maintenance gear I used constantly. When I came back out 15 minutes later, the tools were gone. My first reaction was confusion rather than alarm. I checked the ground, thinking I'd misremembered where. I'd set them, looked in the shed, though I knew I hadn't gone there. Started to wonder if my isolation was affecting my memory more than I'd admitted. Then I saw them, laid out in a perfect row on the porch boards, about 3 feet from where I'd left them. Hammer, saw, hatchet, arranged by size, smallest to largest. And they were clean. The hammerhead that had been spotted with rust was now polished. The saw blade that had accumulated sap was pristine. Even the hatchet showed its original steel finish instead of the tarnish I'd been ignoring. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Something had taken my tools, cleaned them, and returned them. Not hidden or destroyed or carried off as trophies. Borrowed and returned, like you'd do with a neighbor. The implications were staggering. This suggested not just intelligence, but cultural behavior, concepts of borrowing, ownership, reciprocity. And the cleaning wasn't just scraping off debris. Someone had worked those tools carefully, removed corrosion, made them better than they'd been. I picked up the hammer with shaking hands, examining it in the fading light. No damage. No teeth marks or crushing that would suggest improvised cleaning. Just methodical restoration. That night I sat on my porch with a beer, one of 6 I'd bought in Randall, and had been rationing, and spoke out loud to the darkening forest. "Thank you," I said, "for the tools. You didn't have to do that." Silence for a long moment. Then, from maybe 50 yards out, a low vocalization. Not threatening. Almost gentle, if something that deep could be gentle. A sound that felt like acknowledgement. I took a long drink and continued. "I know this is strange, you watching me feeding you. I don't know what you are or where you came from. But I want you to know I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. This is just between us." Another vocalization, slightly different in tone. Then silence again. I finished my beer and went inside, leaving the door unlocked for the first time in months. Some instinct told me I didn't need to lock it anymore. Whatever was out there had decided I wasn't a threat. And after a year of this strange communion, I decided the same thing about it. That night, I slept better than I had since the divorce. For the first time and longer than I could remember, I wasn't alone in my exile. The isolation I'd sought had been filled by something I'd never expected, connection with something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. I didn't know then how little time we had left. Didn't know that forces beyond my understanding were already aware of what was happening on my 40 acres, had been watching longer than I'd been feeding, and were preparing to end it. August 26th, 2020. The day everything ended. I was checking my mail at the end of the gravel drive, about a quarter mile from the, quote, cabin. I made the walk every few days when I remembered, though most of what came was junk addressed to the previous owner. That morning it was pension-related paperwork I didn't want to deal with and a hunting supply catalog. I heard the vehicles before I saw them. 2 black SUVs coming up. Forest Road 23. Moving too fast for the condition of the road. They slowed when they saw me, then turned into my drive, blocking my exit back to the cabin. My first thought was something had happened. Forest fire, maybe, or some emergency that required evacuation. But the way they positioned the vehicles, deliberate, controlling, set off alarms from my old enforcement days. 4 people emerged. 2 men in dark suits, both wearing sunglasses, despite the forest canopy. A woman, maybe 40, in field clothes, but carrying herself like someone used to authority, and trailing behind them, looking deeply uncomfortable, a Lewis County Sheriff's deputy I vaguely recognized from my warden days. The lead agent, tall, maybe late 40s, with the bland face of someone who'd practiced being forgettable, approached with his badge out. Homeland Security. Not Forest Service, not Fish and Wildlife. Homeland Security. "Mr. Hartley," he said. "Not a question. We need to talk about your activities on this property." My mouth went dry. "What activities?" "Your interactions with an undocumented species." His tone was flat, bureaucratic, like he was reading from a script. "We've been monitoring the situation. Your feeding schedule, your documentation attempts, your journal entries. All of it poses significant ecological and national security concerns." The woman stepped forward, introduced herself as Dr. something or other, Forest Service Wildlife Biology Division. She didn't offer a handshake, just looked at me with eyes that said she'd rather be anywhere else. "How long have you been watching me?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The agent ignored the place. "Question. We need to collect certain materials, your trail cameras, any photographic or video evidence, biological samples you've collected, and your field journal. These materials are being classified under federal ecological security protocols. This is my property. You can't just... We can." He pulled out a tablet, tapped it a few times. "You're in violation of federal regulations regarding interaction with protected research subjects. We can charge you with trespassing on federally controlled land, yes. Even though you own the deed, interfering with a protected research initiative, and potentially detaining you for further questioning." I looked at the deputy. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Or," the agent continued, "you can sign a non-disclosure agreement, cooperate with material confiscation, and this goes away. Your choice. But make it now." They gave me 30 minutes. I led them back to the cabin. Watched them methodically bag everything. The Bushnell camera, the backup unit I'd ordered, my Nikon with its memory card, the Ziploc bags with hair samples I'd kept locked in my file box, even my personal photographs of tracks in the lean-to structure, and my journal, 3 months of daily entries, measurements, observations, sketches. The agent flipped through it briefly, then sealed it in an evidence bag without comment. The NDA was 6 pages of legal language that boiled down to say nothing, write nothing, share nothing, or face federal prosecution. I read it twice, hands shaking with anger and something close to grief. What was I even feeding? I asked. What is it? That information is classified, the agent said. How long have you known about it? Also, classified. I signed. What choice did I have? They'd made it clear refusal meant detention, charges, maybe prison. And for what? To protect something I'd already decided to keep secret anyway? They were gone within an hour. The SUVs rolled back down the drive, taking with them every piece of evidence that I hadn't imagined the past year. The deputy was the last to leave, and just before getting in his vehicle, he turned back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, then drove away. I stood in my empty cabin, the file box open on the table, and felt the weight of the silence, not the forest's silence that had become familiar. This was different. The absence of possibility, the end of connection. That night, around midnight, I heard it. A low, mournful vocalization from the ridgeline, unlike any sound I'd heard before. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then repeated. Almost questioning, almost searching. I wanted to respond, wanted to go out there and explain, but I couldn't. The NDA, the threat of surveillance, the fear they were still watching it paralyzed me. The vocalization came a third time, then silence, and I understood with horrible certainty that something out there was calling for me, and I couldn't answer. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I sat in the dark cabin with every light off, listening to that mournful vocalization echo across the ridgeline 3 times before fading into silence that felt like accusation. The NDA sat on my kitchen table, 6 pages of legal threats that boiled down to one message. Forget what you saw, forget what you learned, or we'll destroy what's left of your life. I'd signed it. What choice did I have? But signing didn't make me believe it was right. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and tried to make sense of what had happened. Were they really government? The badges looked legitimate, the vehicles had official plates, but something about the whole operation felt wrong, too smooth, too prepared. Like they'd done this before, many times, following a script refined over years. How long had they been watching me? The lead agent knew about my feeding schedule, specific days, specific times. He'd mentioned my journal entries, which meant they'd either been reading over my shoulder somehow or had access to surveillance I'd never detected. The property was 40 acres of dense forest. How do you monitor someone that completely without them knowing? And the biggest question, the one that kept circling back, what was I feeding? The NDA called it an undocumented species and a protected research initiative, but provided 0 details, no scientific classification, no acknowledgement of whether it was endangered, dangerous, or simply inconvenient to whatever agenda they were protecting. The vagueness felt deliberate, designed to keep me from even knowing what I was being silenced about. I thought about the previous owner, Carlson, how he'd left in a hurry, abandoning tools and half-finished projects. Had the same team shown up at his door? Was that why he'd walked away from property he legally owned? The thought made my stomach turn. This wasn't about me. This was a pattern, a system, something that had been operating across the Cascades, maybe, across the country for who knows how long. Containing encounters, silencing witnesses, making sure whatever was out there stayed classified, stayed hidden, stayed under their control. Around midnight I heard it again, that vocalization from the ridgeline, low and questioning, almost pleading. My throat tightened. I wanted to go to the door, wanted to call back, wanted to explain that I hadn't abandoned the connection willingly, but I couldn't. The satellite phone on my shelf might as well have been a listening device. The cabin itself might be wired. Hell, they might have drones overhead right now, watching with infrared to make sure I complied. So I sat in the dark and listened to something call for me, and I did nothing. The vocalization repeated. Then again. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the windows, waiting for some sign. Nothing came. The forest stayed quiet except for normal sounds, wind, the creek, a few early birds starting their territorial calls. When light finally broke through the trees, I walked outside to check the property. Everything looked normal. The feeding stump was empty, no new tracks, no signs of overnight visitation. But the absence felt deliberate, like something had come close enough to know I was there, found me unresponsive, and left. I spent the day in a fog, going through motions without purpose. By evening, I understood something that made the isolation worse than it had ever been. I hadn't just lost the creature's trust. I'd lost my own sense of what was real and what was permitted to be real. And that difference would haunt me more than any monster ever could. I obeyed the order. What else could I do? For the next week, I stayed inside after dark, left no food at the stump, avoided even looking toward the forest edge for too long. The NDA sat in my file box like a loaded gun pointed at my future. Every time I thought about defying it, I remembered the agent's flat tone. Severe legal consequences. Prison, maybe. Federal charges. The end of whatever life I had left. But the property didn't stay quiet. On the third morning after the confiscation, I found my woodpile 4 cords I'd stacked carefully for the coming winter toppled and scattered across the yard, not knocked over by wind or animals. Thrown. The logs were spread in a pattern that suggested deliberate destruction, almost rage. Some had been hurled 15-20 feet from the original stack. I stood there in the cold morning air, looking at the mess, and felt something break inside my chest. The fence posts came next. 3 of them uprooted from the ground and tossed into the creek, the wire fencing torn and twisted. The lean-to structure from last winter, the one that had faced my kitchen window, was demolished, branches snapped and scattered like kindling, not weathered apart, destroyed. On the morning of September 2nd, I found the message. It was in the dirt beside my porch steps, pressed deep into the soil where I'd walked the day before. A massive handprint, fingers splayed, each digit clearly defined. And right next to it, like someone had placed them side by side for comparison, was my own boot track from yesterday. The juxtaposition was deliberate, human and other, small and massive. The message was clear, even if I couldn't speak its language. Why, or maybe, goodbye, or maybe, you betrayed me. I crouched there for a long time, staring at those 2 prints side by side, and understood something that made the isolation unbearable. The creature, whatever it was, had recognized our exchanges as communication, had interpreted my sudden silence as choice, not coercion. It thought I'd abandoned the connection willingly, and I had no way to explain. That afternoon, around 3 o'clock, I heard them. Wood knocks from the ridgeline, distant and fading. Not the rhythmic pattern from before, not answering any sound I'd made. Just 3 deliberate strikes, spaced maybe 5 seconds apart, moving away toward the high country. I stood on my porch, listening as they faded, growing fainter with distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. The forest went quiet after that. Not the wrong quiet from when I'd first arrived, the normal quiet of a functioning ecosystem. Birds returned to their territorial calls. Squirrels thrashed through undergrowth. The creek ran over stones with its usual sound. Even the wind seemed to move differently through the trees, no longer carrying that sense of presence. Whatever had been watching me was gone. I spent the rest of that week in a daze, going through motions without purpose. The property felt different now, bigger somehow, emptier, like a stage after the performances ended and the audiences left. I was alone again, truly alone, in a way I hadn't been since the previous summer. And the worst part was knowing I'd done this. Not intentionally, not willingly, but I'd signed the paper. I'd complied. I'd chosen my own safety over something that had chosen to trust me. The file box sat on my shelf with the NDA inside, a record of my cowardice more than my compliance. By the second week of September, I'd stopped checking the forest edge, stopped listening for sounds that wouldn't come. The connection was severed, and no amount of wishful thinking would restore it. Something had been here. Something had reached out across the species barrier, had tried to communicate, had demonstrated intelligence and restraint, and something that looked a lot like companionship. And I'd let bureaucrats with badges and legal threats take it away. Autumn 2020 passed in numb routine. I maintained the cabin, fished the creek without joy, split wood I didn't need just to have something to do with my hands. The silence was unbearable, not the forest's silence, but the absence where presence had been. I'd sought isolation when I bought this property, but I'd found something else instead. and losing it was worse than the loneliness I'd started with. I stopped writing, stopped researching, followed the NDA to the letter because what choice did I have? But the questions wouldn't leave me alone. How many others had experienced this? How long had the containment been operating? And what the hell was out there that required this level of secrecy? On October 27th, I made a decision that probably violated the spirit of the NDA, even if not the letter. I drove to the Mount Adams Ranger Station, about 40 minutes west, outside my usual district. I needed to talk to Ruth Kemp. Ruth and I had worked together for 15 years before my retirement, though in adjacent districts. She was maybe 62 now, 2 years from her own retirement, with more backcountry experience than anyone I knew. And unlike most rangers, she'd always taken the unusual activity reports seriously, instead of dismissing them as civilian imagination. I found her in the station's break room, reviewing trail condition reports. She looked up when I entered, and something in her expression told me she'd been expecting me eventually. "Chuck," she said carefully. "Been a while. Can we talk? Off the record?" She glanced toward the security camera in the corner, then nodded toward the back exit. "Let's walk." We headed down a service trail behind the station, out of camera range. Ruth kept checking over her shoulder, her movements practiced and cautious. "You've had a visit," she said. "Not a question." My throat tightened. "How did you know?" "Because you're the fourth person in 2 years who's come to me with that look. The ones who've had contact and then had it .co.entained." She stopped walking, turned to face me. "What did they take?" "Everything. Cameras, journal, hair samples. Made me sign an NDA. Ruth nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Ecological security protocols. That what they grewy. Called it, yeah, and a protected research initiative. But they wouldn't tell me what I was even time." I stopped, aware even now of how paranoid this sounded. "How long has this been happening?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking back toward the station as if calculating how much she could say. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Decades, Chuck. Similar interventions across the Cascades, always the same pattern. Civilian makes sustained contact with unidentified large primates. Federal task force shows up, everything gets classified. I've seen memos referencing relict hominid management protocols, but those files disappear fast. Joint operation, Forest Service, DOD, Homeland Security. But why? If they're real, if they've known for decades, I don't know why." She met my eyes, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Fear. "But I know enough to tell you, don't dig further. I'm 2 years from pension, Chuck. I've watched colleagues forced into early retirement for asking too many questions. Whatever this is, it's bigger than you or me or any single witness. So we just let them bury it. We survive," Ruth said quietly. "That's all we can do." I thanked her and left, understanding that I'd just confirmed what I'd suspected. My experience wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, managed and suppressed, leaving a trail of silenced witnesses across the wilderness. Somewhere in these mountains, something was being hidden. And people like me were collateral damage in a containment operation we'd never see coming. Winter 2020 to 2021 was colder than the first, and lonelier. In mid-January, a package arrived. Brown padded envelope, no return address, postmarked from Seattle. Inside was my confiscated journal and a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Your cooperation is appreciated and monitored." I opened the journal with shaking hands. Entire pages had been fino, redacted thick black bars covering whole entries, dates removed, measurements obscured, my handwriting visible only in fragments, 18 inches, and deliberate placement, and intelligence suggests the rest was classified. My own observations, my own words, deemed too dangerous for me to possess. I kept it in the locked file box and tried to move on. Couldn't, because small things kept happening. Fresh tracks near my property line, stopping exactly at the survey markers as if something understood boundaries now. Not crossing, just patrolling. I'd find them in snow or mud, always at the edge, never closer. Distant silhouettes on the ridgeline at dawn. I'd grab binoculars, hands fumbling with cold, and by the time I focused, nothing. Just trees and rock and morning mist. Once, during a February thaw, I found a raven feather placed on my porch railing. Single black feather, positioned upright as if planted there deliberately. Ravens don't perch on that railing. Never have. Were these signs from the creature? Proof it still watched from a distance, unable or unwilling to approach, but not quite gone? Or was this the surveillance team reminding me I was still being monitored, still constrained by the NDA I'd signed? The ambiguity was maddening. Worse than knowing would have been. I stopped sleeping well, would wake at 3 a.m. and check the windows, looking for movement that never came. My hands developed a tremor I couldn't control. Gray spread through my beard like frost. The isolation I'd sought when I bought this property had become a prison. I'd found something real, something meaningful. And bureaucrats with badges had taken it away and left me with nothing but redacted pages and the suffocating certainty that truth was less important than secrecy. By March, I'd tried twice to sell the property. No offers came through, not even lowball attempts. The realtor finally admitted, off the record, that the land seemed to be flagged in some database she couldn't access, blacklisted. Even my escape route was controlled. Spring 2021 arrived, but I barely noticed. I'd aged a decade in 18 months. My reflection showed a man I didn't recognize, gray beard, hollow eyes, hands that shook when I tried to hold my coffee mug steady. The cabin felt less like home and more like a monument to failure. One evening in early May, I sat on the porch at dusk and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I spoke out loud to the empty forest. "I'm sorry," I said, to whatever might still be listening. I had no choice. They would have destroyed me if I didn't comply. I miss this. I miss knowing the world held more mystery than my failed career ever showed me. Silence. Just wind in the Douglas firs and the creek running over stones. I sat there until full dark, waiting for something that didn't come. No vocalizations, no wood knocks, no signs, just the normal sounds of a functioning forest ecosystem that had moved on without me. Around 9 p.m., I stood to go inside. That's when I caught it faint, but unmistakable. Ammonia and wet fur, distant on the wind, there and gone so quickly, I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, listening, breathing shallow, waiting. Far up the mountain, barely audible, a single wood knock echoed, then faded. I don't know if it was farewell, or forgiveness, or warning. Don't know if the creature understood what had happened, or if it simply moved on to territory where humans weren't a complication. Don't even know if that single knock was real or just wishful thinking in the darkness. But I know this. Somewhere in those mountains, something remains. Older and more patient than governments or paperwork. Watching not just me, but all of us. Waiting for the moment we're ready to acknowledge what we've always refused to see. I locked my door that night, added a log to the stove, and understood something that still keeps me awake. I'll never truly be alone again. But I'd already lost the only witness that mattered. The file box sits on my shelf, redacted journal inside. A record of something real that the world will never believe. If you're reading this, if somehow this testimony reaches you, understand what I learned. Some truths are more dangerous kept than spoken, and more isolating when they're taken away. Don't go looking for what I found, and if it finds you, don't let them make you sign.